Episode 3, Common Sense.
You're listening to Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we explore ideas and techniques that help you break down partisan barriers, build rapport across the aisle, and make a more persuasive case for the Second Amendment. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about why gun control gets support. In soft skills, I'll talk about what to do next after you've identified values. And John's bad argument of the day tackles the myth of common sense. But first, how are you doing, John?
I'm doing really good.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's been really exciting to see these first few episodes go out into the world. Not only have they been a lot of work to produce, but we've both had a little trepidation about addressing some of these issues since we're aware of how people react to new or different information. However, I think the response has been overwhelmingly positive, which is fantastic. I hear a lot lately about polarization fatigue and outrage fatigue or frustration about poor communication. So I think we might be right on time with the zeitgeist, and I'm really appreciative of how many people are tuning in for this already.
I agree. I think we're saying the right thing at the right time, and I think people are just so sick of the divide. It's really fatiguing. And I think that contributes to people being a little more open to maybe trying a different way.
Yeah, I think people are looking for an escape hatch out of the outrage inferno.
Yeah, accurate. I know I am. I find it completely exhausting. But what's cool is that we've gotten some really thoughtful and well-considered feedback from some of our listeners on the earlier episodes. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful for that. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us and engage with us on our social media, Facebook and Instagram, not so much Twitter. Thank you for leaving us reviews and for sharing our podcast. That really helps us, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, for sure. When I first started doing this kind of advocacy, it used to be you'd go to a hearing and there would be 500 people there from the pro-gun side and just a handful from the anti-gun side. And it seems like lately that's been changing. And the last couple of hearings I went to, it was more like 50-50. So they're getting a big groundswell of support. And I'm just curious where you think that's coming from.
Well, on the one hand, some of that has evolved out of the tribalism that we have. So if your tribe signals X, you're going to support X.
Right.
Another reason is that people see something negative occurring in the world that bothers them, and they're motivated to action. And the infrastructure that's in place for gun control activism is a path towards action. And when people get spun up and feel empowered to participate in finding a solution for a problem they perceive, there's a ready-made, deliverable activity for them to participate in.
And it's political. Yeah. Whereas the pro-gun side, often in the aftermath of some kind of tragedy, what we do is we take individual action. We say, I'm going to go out, I'm going to take a self-defense class, I'm going to learn how to use this medical gear, I'm going to learn how to apply a tourniquet, and I'm going to take action to protect myself.
I think some of that is a values divide.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is that some people value collective action and some people value individualism.
Yes.
What would help our side out a lot is that if we had a ready-made, deliverable collective action for people who want to solve this problem. Now, to some degree, we have a ready-made collective action where we circle the wagons expecting the attack of gun control. That's not an inviting maneuver. We need to have a system of activism in place that gives people social solutions.
Right. So you're saying that when we do that, it works for us and it works for the choir, but it doesn't attract anyone outside of the choir to the action that we need.
We need to have some policy proposals in place that reduce suicide and interpersonal violence that we can offer to people to engage in with us.
Right. So then that way people who are motivated towards political action and collective action have a place to go. And rather than just saying no to everyone all the time, which can be perceived as obstructionist or selfish or unfeeling and cold, we actually have a channel and a pathway for those people to feel like they're doing something to help. Why do you think a lot of that political action focuses on guns specifically?
I think guns are perceived as something of a low-hanging fruit. Since guns can be identified as a common denominator in the American violence environment, it's easy to conflate that commonality with causality, and people feel like it's obvious that by addressing guns, they can put a dent in violence. That's part of the dangerous trap of obviousness. First, something feels obvious, and then they name the problem after the obvious solution they think they've perceived. They then go and call it gun violence. So the solution is smuggled into the name, and that comes with it the presumption that you don't really need to know that much more about the issue. It's gun violence. We're attacking guns and violence. Later in this episode, we're going to be talking about the trap of obviousness and the abuse of the term common sense.
What's interesting about that messaging around gun violence is that's a result of having a very strong top-down organization. The anti-gun movement is largely funded by a couple of key players, and that makes it a lot easier for them to have a top-down strategy and some message discipline. And they also have a lot of money to put into research and focus groups and things like smuggling the so-called obvious solution right into the name of the problem. That's an intentional strategy. So that's something that is done on purpose to conflate the two. And that's an area where our side, as the traditionally much more grassroots side, we're a little bit more like herding cats. We have a lot of people that feel very strongly about this on an individual level and are motivated to take action on an individual level. We don't have the message discipline, and we don't have the strategy that some of these bigger gun control groups have.
I think another reason that gun control gets a lot of support depends on the political divide that we're experiencing right now in this country, insofar as the less contact that people of different political opinions have with each other, the more you can say whatever you want about the other side to an audience who doesn't know any better. There's like a Plato's cave going on here where one person can describe reality to you because you have no contact with it. Through that, they can leverage fundamental misconceptions about gun culture and gun owners.
A lot of support for gun control comes from people who are able to dehumanize and villainize the pro-gun side. And it's just because they haven't had that contact. They don't have the familiarity with gun culture. They don't know about the positive impacts of it. And that makes it a lot easier to say, you people are the problem. Therefore, the solutions we come up with can punish you, and that's okay.
Yeah, we're baby killers and war profiteers and selfish murderers. If it's possible to characterize gun owners as bad people, then it doesn't really matter what you do to them. It's okay to use legislation punitively. You can make the gun owners pay for the cost of violence. If it's their, quote, fanatical love of guns, which keeps guns present in our society, then we can craft legislation that causes gun owners to bear some cost or penalty for that. So it's like, why are you, passing laws that are only going to affect law-abiding gun owners? Well, some of it might have to do with the degree to which that feels fair to someone who isn't a gun owner.
It's a lot easier to do that when you don't know any gun owners and when you don't have any good relationships there and you don't have investment or a stake in that community because you think they're your enemy. What we want to do instead is give people more of a positive interaction. We don't want to just confirm their biases and stereotypes about us. We want to actually stand for something, and we want to be able to express ourselves in a way that speaks to them a little better than what we're doing now.
And another thing is that building better relationships and improving your communication is just the right thing to do.
Yeah, there's a moral and an ethical element to good communication.
We don't want to win this argument at the expense of cutting someone else down.
Yeah, that's counterproductive. We want to build a community that includes liberals and conservatives and the Second Amendment, and we can actually work towards solving problems in society and getting to the actual root causes of the things that are plaguing us. And this is the way to do that, both pragmatically and morally. It's the right thing to do for one, but it also works better, so it gets us towards our desired outcome.
Right, and there's an element of this where there's like a rising tide that lifts all boats. Something to keep in mind is that if you're always out to win and you're winning constantly, then everyone else becomes a loser. Now, in terms of competition, that's fine. But in terms of relationships that you need to maintain, either with your friends and family and spouse or with the 50% of the other inhabitants in this country, we can't treat it like a zero-sum game. And we can't create an environment in which one side always loses. That's disenfranchisement, resentment, lack of willingness to work on issues together in the future. We need to have a significant amount of mutual understanding and mutual winning going on.
And the cool thing about this is that it's not a zero-sum game. This is a problem-solving effort. And there are solutions out there that we'll get into in future episodes that give each side a win. So we can both win. Like, we can keep our civil rights, we can expand and protect the Second Amendment, and we can also reduce death and make safer communities. So it's not like one of us has to win and one of us has to lose. There's enough there for both of us to win if we can just get past some of this tribalism.
Yeah, this is the pragmatic and moral way to do this. Now, you can't force someone to change their mind, and it would be unethical to manipulate someone's mind against their will. But you can be supportive of an emotional state that makes them receptive to new information.
Exactly. If you encourage a person to change to an emotional state that allows them to receive new information, then that new information adds to their body of knowledge, and that helps them come to their own decisions in a more informed way, and that helps everyone.
Yeah, I don't know anyone who's really well informed about guns and gun law who supports more gun control legislation. The more you know about this, the less strident your views on gun control become, I think. And if we can encourage people to be curious and understand that a greater breadth of knowledge is required to come to the solutions and outcomes that they desire, we will eventually move people to a more moderate position.
I've noticed that too. Yeah, when we come together like that, when we build that familiarity, when we are open to new information, and when we help educate people, not in a manipulative way, not to change their mind, but just to give them more information to do whatever they want with. A lot of times that means that that new information adds to the complexity of the topic, which makes simple and obvious solutions less attractive.
Yeah, I too am against interpersonal violence and suicide, and I want to be a part of people's understanding on what's going to get them the results they want on those issues. Agreement on specific policy right now isn't the goal we're looking for. We're looking for the agreement to have continued conversations in which we come to a greater understanding of how we're going to solve this problem.
In Soft Skills, we'll talk about specific, actionable techniques to help you become a more persuasive communicator.
What would you say you do here?
Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand that? What the hell is wrong with you people?
In the last episode, we worked on identifying values. We focused on finding the intent of the person, even if it's not explicitly stated, and using context clues to identify what they find important. Now, this week we're going to move on to the next step, and that's what to do with the values we identified. We'll talk a little bit about validation, common ground, and separating outcomes from positions.
So you've asked someone a values question, and you think you have a pretty good idea of what their values are. Now what?
The first thing you want to do is validate the values. The reason why you want to do that is because that person has trusted you with some personal information, and you want to repay that trust and continue creating goodwill. And this is part of the rapport building process, which is crucial to getting people to be open-minded and listen and be willing to receive new information. The goal there is to create a positive mental state that'll allow you to do two things: present new information and allow that information to be relevant to their worldview.
How do you apply that in practice?
The first thing you can do is summarize what they said and just ask if you got it right. Giving a recap shows that you're listening, and it makes people feel heard. Even if you get it wrong, it gives them an opportunity to clarify. And they might say, "No, I didn't mean this, but I did mean this." And there's an opportunity there for further discussion. When you identify the value, you have to frame it in a way that casts the person in a positive light.
That can be a little challenging, especially if you're feeling confronted or insulted by their expression of their values. But in the last episode, we talked about taking a pause to collect your thoughts and putting any of those implied insults or confrontations in your mental airlock, giving them the benefit of the doubt and reorienting your attitude.
Yeah, that can keep you from making a big mistake like saying, "Sounds like you're a statist liberal who hates freedom. Do I have that right?"
No one wants to be the villain in their own narrative, and they'll rewrite the entire narrative to avoid that.
Instead, you can try something like, "It sounds like you really care about making your community safer, and you're sensitive to the suffering of people affected by violence. Am I understanding you right?" The next step is to find common ground on the values. And if you've broken it down to a root value rather than a position statement, this should be pretty easy to do.
What's the difference between values and positions?
Values are your fundamental beliefs, and positions are statements about things you want to see happen. So, for example, a position would be, "I think we should have fewer guns in society."
You may never agree on that position.
A value, on the other hand, would be, "Stable and safe societies are good."
I think most people can agree on that. Even though we already live in a pretty safe society, we've all experienced tragedy and suffering.
Yeah, we have that in common. And what we want to do is try to separate the values from the positions and find common ground on the values. And common ground is really important.
If you make people think they're wrong and bad about everything, they'll rewrite all of reality to avoid those negative feelings. And you would do the same thing.
And if you really think back, you probably, with the benefit of hindsight, can see that you have done those things in the past. I know I have. As much as I would like to say otherwise, I don't always practice what I preach. It's a process, though. And it's one of those things where if you can start out just getting it right 10% of the time, you practice, you get better at it. And next time you get it right 15% of the time, you're already making a difference and you're already helping the cause. Rather than making people feel wrong, instead you want to make them feel right. And you also want to show that you're fair about acknowledging their good points. Fairness is essential to a good conversation. Nobody wants to waste their breath on a dead-end conversation that they feel isn't getting anywhere.
You have to acknowledge people and provide positive reinforcement.
We talked about that a little bit in our Thanksgiving dinner episode. To express common ground, there are a few basic things you can do. And the first one, super easy. You can simply say, "I agree." You want to make it clear that you're agreeing with the value, but you don't have to make a huge point of disagreeing with the position. You can actually safely ignore the position, which sounds a little bit crazy if you're used to the conventional worldview on arguments where you have to refute every wrong thing that they say. But you actually don't need to do that. You can focus on areas of agreement. Another way to express common ground is to tell a personal story or to reveal a personal detail about yourself. Appropriate self-disclosure builds trust. So, for example, you might say, "It sounds like you're saying you want your kids to grow up safe and happy. I feel the same way. I worry about my kids sometimes, and I want them to be safe in school." And if you don't have a relevant or appropriate personal story, you can just express empathy. And you can say something like, "I think it's reasonable to feel that way. I think I'd feel the same way if I had kids. I know I'd worry about them, and I'd want them to be safe." The key there is to make the person feel understood and make them feel that they're right to feel that way.
Sounds like this goes counter to a lot of advice we typically hear. Usually you just hear, hammer them with facts until they're forced to admit they're wrong.
Yeah, that is the prevailing wisdom, but it doesn't actually work. That's the problem. It only makes people defensive, and it triggers this thing called the backfire effect, which is an interesting phenomenon. It turns out that trying to prove someone wrong with facts that threaten their worldview actually makes them believe the wrong thing harder. Instead, what works is building rapport, identifying values, and then introducing new information in a way that fits with their existing worldview.
That's a lot more difficult.
It sure is. This is advanced level stuff. It takes a lot of practice, and you should expect it to take a lot of time to get good at it, but it is worth it. Once you've validated the values and found common ground, you can find out what outcomes they want and work towards agreement on outcomes.
Why did you make a distinction there with outcomes? How are they related to values?
Outcomes are your true goals. They're what you really want, and they might be different from what you say you want. So sometimes it can be difficult to trace them backwards and figure out what the real outcomes are. For example, someone who advocates for gun control policy might say their goal is to implement background checks. If you look at that, the policy is background checks. The position behind the policy is that making it harder to get guns will reduce criminal access and save lives. And then the value behind that position is that safe and stable societies are good.
But what's the actual outcome they're looking for?
The outcome is actually just saving lives. They want safe societies and they want fewer gun-related deaths.
So you're saying the actual goal isn't just to pass a bill?
No, I don't think so. With a few exceptions, almost everyone supporting this policy isn't actually all that attached to the policy itself. What they really want is the outcome. So if you can agree on the outcome and then you can agree on the values, you've doubled your amount of common ground.
So when we do get around to discussing policy, it's going to be a lot easier having laid this foundation of trust and agreement.
Exactly. For now, we just want to practice finding common ground on values and outcomes. And once you found it, just let it percolate for a while. Make it clear that you respect their opinions, whether or not they agree with you. You don't have to rush to discuss policy and get into that much trickier territory of areas where you might not ever agree. You want to just give them a little more time to formulate their own opinions. You want to support them as a friend, and you want a little bit of time for that trust you've established to settle in a little bit.
Like we said before, the goal is not to change their mind in that moment. The goal is to have another conversation.
So we have worked on understanding and validating their values. In the next episode, we're going to talk about how to frame your argument to appeal to their values and make sure it fits into their worldview.
In today's bad argument of the day, we address the dangerous trap of the common sense fallacy and the problems with universalizing our perceptions of obviousness. Common sense does not consist of some universally held, predetermined, codified set of propositions and beliefs. From what I can tell, common sense refers to one's own initial gut reaction and whatever solutions are likely to seem obvious to someone without deep knowledge of the problem. Man, I don't know why it's so hard to just XYZ this problem. That almost never means that XYZ are as easy and correct as you think they may be. The most true part of that statement is, I don't know why it's so hard. If I find myself thinking this about a topic, that's usually a clue that I need to learn more before addressing the problem. Not that I'm some secret genius who has it all figured out. If it's obvious to me, someone has already thought of it. A good way to tell if someone is an expert or not is if they answer questions with, it's complicated instead of, it's obvious. Obviousness is not an inherent feature of a thing. It's an event which occurs internally to us. It's profoundly subjective, but we experience it as being objective to anyone who has eyes to see.
The sensation of obviousness is generated entirely by our individual experience and perspective. As pattern seekers and recognizers, obviousness occurs when we believe that we've made a connection to an existing pattern we've experienced. Things don't feel obvious unless we can relate it to something we already know about, and it feels really good to make those connections.
Our brains actually make dopamine when we recognize a pattern. The more that things feel obvious, the better we feel. This, however, is a trap. Anyone who values rationality owes it to themselves to be skeptical of things which feel obvious. Not only are things far more complex than their superficial appearance, almost as a rule, you also don't want to privilege an emotional or chemical reaction to your initial perception over actual useful information. Not only does the discovery of the obvious feel really good, things like indecision or mystery or directionlessness can cause a lot of anxiety. Relieving that anxiety can make jumping to obvious conclusions feel really satisfying.
That also presents a challenge when describing complexity to people. They've already had an extremely positive experience with their perception of obviousness and have a lifelong positive relationship with recognizing patterns of obviousness. Introducing complexity is like telling people that one of their absolute favorite things isn't good for them. And this is also part of why it's so hard to talk people out of conspiracy theories and extreme ideologies.
The appeal to common sense is an attempt to insulate against complexity and bad feelings by relying on cognitive biases that involve consensus. Consensus can be, and has been, a useful tool. It's our most primitive reality check, and has done a lot of heavy lifting for humans, especially when all we needed was a superficial understanding of the material world. Complex systems and national policy, however, are far outside the scope of common sense. Reliance on universalizing obviousness and appealing to common sense sets up a house of cards in which a whole population's emotional state and even moral framework can depend on maintaining this consensus.
Just ask Galileo.
Appeals to common sense are, at best, an appeal to consensus fallacy, and the desire for a group validation of that perspective. At their worst, they're a form of sleight of hand which launders opinion into policy. Any sufficiently informed cynic understands the power of validating obviousness and how much stronger that emotional connection is than actual data when it comes to public opinion. When I hear someone appeal to common sense in a political context, I hear them saying, our collective lack of knowledge is our power, and the more of us there are, the more correct we become. It isn't just a matter of manipulation. Common sense harms the believers by foreclosing on the addition of complex truths to their analysis. This form of groupthink gaslights others and marginalizes the voices which have the most to offer the group in terms of utility, perspective, and information. Anyone who contradicts the group's notion of common sense is crazy, evil, or a heretic. But the world doesn't stay flat forever. The best thing that can happen to a group of people participating in buttressing each other's notions of common sense is to have their bubble burst, trading a temporary emotional downturn for genuinely useful tools. Tools which allow you to avoid unintended consequences and which instead generate real results.
Something is only obvious to the people who've had enough similar experiences that it fits in the pattern they expect. Common sense puts us in thought silos, banishing both differing experiences and genuine expertise.
If we're going to describe our own values as obvious, it's worth finding the difference in experience between us and those who disagree, and inviting them to partake in some of the experiences which comprise the patterns we're inclined to detect in the world. We can't use obviousness or common sense as rhetorical cudgels to shame and belabor those who've had different experiences than us. Instead, relate the values and experiences which shape your views.
Thanks for listening to Guns Guide to Liberals. Our next episode will be a special report on mass shootings with Brian Strasser, a crisis management and security expert. He'll be talking about what both sides of the aisle get wrong about mass shootings and what we can learn from the newest research.
Make sure to like, share, subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and Facebook. More testosterone than science allows in every portion. Grow hair on your eyes with testosterone-injected beef. Now at the InfoWars store.
Oh my god. Where did you come up with this stuff?